Fort Sill is a United States Army post in Lawton, Oklahoma, about 85 miles southwest of Oklahoma City. Today, Fort Sill remains the only active Army installation of all the forts on the Southern Plains built during the Indian Wars. It is designated as a National Historic Landmark and serves as home of the United States Army Field Artillery School as well as the Marine Corps site for Field Artillery MOS School, United States Army Air Defense Artillery School, the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, the 75th Fires Brigade and the 214th Fires Brigade. Fort Sill is also one of the 4 locations for Army basic combat training. It has played a significant role in every major American conflict since 1869. As of June 2012, Major General Mark McDonald is the Commanding General of the Fires Center of Excellence in Fort Sill. History: the site of Fort Sill was staked out on January 8, 1869, by Major General Philip H. Sheridan, who led a campaign into Indian Territory to stop hostile tribes from raiding border settlements in Texas and Kansas. Sheridan's massive winter campaign involved 6 cavalry regiments accompanied by frontier scouts such as Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Ben Clark and Jack Stilwell. Troops camped at the location of the new fort included the 7th Cavalry, the 19th Kansas Volunteers and the 10th Cavalry, a distinguished group of Black Buffalo soldiers, who constructed many of the stone buildings still surrounding the old post quadrangle. At first, the garrison was called Camp Wichita, and was referred to by the Indians as the Soldier House at Medicine Bluffs. Sheridan later named it in honor of his West Point classmate and friend, Brigadier General Joshua W. Sill, who was killed during the American Civil War. The first post commander was Brevet Major General Benjamin Grierson and the first Indian agent was Colonel Albert Gallatin Boone, grandson of Daniel Boone. Other forts in the frontier fort system were Forts Griffin, Concho, Belknap, Chadbourne, Fort Stockton, Fort Davis, Fort Bliss, McCarvert, Clark, Fort McIntosh, Fort Inge, Phantom Hill, and Richardson in Texas. There were sub-posts or intermediate stations including Buvvick Station on Salt Creek between Fort Richardson and Fort Belknap, Camp Wichita near Buffalo Springs between Fort Richardson and Red River Station, and Mountain Pass between Fort Concho and Fort Griffin. Peace policy. Several months after the establishment of Fort Sill, President Ulysses Grant approved a peace policy placing responsibility for the Southwest tribes under Quaker Indian agents. The first Quaker agent assigned to the Kiowa and Comanche Agency was Larry Tatum. Fort Sill soldiers were restricted from taking punitive action against the Indians, who interpreted this as a sign of weakness. The Indians resumed raiding the Texas frontier and used Fort Sill as a sanctuary. In 1871, General of the Army William Tecumseh Sherman arrived at Fort Sill from Fort Richardson, Texas, while on a tour of Army posts throughout the country. Sherman was at Fort Richardson when they became aware of the Warren wagon train raid, in which 7 mule skinners were killed by Indians when their wagon train was ambushed. Soon after Sherman arrived at Fort Sill, the Indian agent brought several Kiowa chiefs to tell their story about attacking the wagon train. When Sherman ordered their arrest during a meeting on Grierson's porch, 2 of the Indians attempted to assassinate him. In memory of the event, the commanding general's quarters were dubbed Sherman House. The Army arrested 3 chiefs during the porch skirmish, Satank, Satanta and Ado Etta. Sherman ordered them to Texas for a civil trial for the murders. When the 3 were put into a wagon and taken under cavalry escort to Fort Richardson, Satank began his death song. A mile down the trail, he grabbed the carbine of one of the troopers in the wagon. Before he could cock and fire it, he was hit by several shots fired by the escort. Satank was left against a tree and the column continued on its mission. A marker on Berry Road near the curve marks the spot where Satank, an honored warrior, fell. His grave is in Chief's Knoll in the Post Cemetery. Satanta and Ado Etta were tried by Texas courts on 5 and 6 July, the first time Indians had been tried in civil courts. They were sentenced to death by hanging. Supporters of the Quaker peace policy convinced Governor Edmund J. Davies to commute the Indians' sentences to life imprisonment. Then in October 1873 they were paroled. Red River War. In June 1874, the Comanches, Kiowas and Southern Cheyennes went to war and the South Plains shook with the hoofbeats of Indian raiders. The resulting Red River War, which lasted a year, was a war of attrition involving relentless pursuit by converging military columns. Without a chance to graze their livestock and faced with the disappearance of the great buffalo herds, the tribes eventually surrendered. Quinner Parker and his Quahadi Comanches were the last to abandon the struggle, and their arrival at Fort Sill in June 1875, marked the end of Indian warfare on the South Plains. In 1877, the first African American to graduate from West Point, Henry O. Flipper, was assigned to the 10th Cavalry Regiment, the famous Buffalo Soldiers at Fort Sill. In addition to his leadership duties in the cavalry, he directed his men to dig a ditch to drain a swamp. This is still called Flipper's Ditch, and a landmark is on Upton Road by the Fort Sill Golf Course. Unlike other U.S. territories, Indian Territory had no organized government, so army posts like Fort Reno, Fort Supply and Fort Sill found themselves the most significant federal and legal presence in a wide territory. They provided protection to Indians and civilians alike, sometimes dealt as mediators between the Indians and the Indian agents, and protected the various Indian tribes against intrusion by the infamous Sooners. At one point in the 1880s, the post was nearly deserted when gold was rumored to have been found in the nearby Wichita Mountains, and officers and soldiers alike rushed to stake claims. Geronimo. In 1894, Geronimo and 341 other Chiricahua Apache prisoners of war were brought to Fort Sill, where they lived in villages scattered around the post. After a couple of years, Geronimo was granted permission to travel with Pawnee Bill's Wild West show, and he joined the Indian contingent at several annual World Expositions and Indian Expositions in the 1890s and early 1900s. Geronimo and other Indians leaders rode in the inaugural parade of President Theodore Roosevelt and met the president himself during that trip. Geronimo and the other Apache prisoners had free range of Fort Sill. He was a member of Fort Sill's Native Scouts, but he did make at least one documented attempt to escape the fort, though not in the dramatic fashion of jumping off the steep Medicine Bluffs on his horse in a hail of bullets as popularized in the 1939 movie, Geronimo. Once, after visiting the off-post home of Chief Quinner Parker, Geronimo decided to escape to his homeland in Arizona late one night rather than return to Fort Sill. He was captured the next day. He died of pneumonia in 1909 and is buried at Fort Sill. The rest of the Apaches remained on Fort Sill until 1913. The Chiricahua had been promised the land surrounding the fort by the U.S. government. However, local non-Indians resisted their settlement. In 1914, two-thirds of the tribe moved on to the Mescalero Apache Reservation, and the remaining third settled on allotments around Fletcher and Apache, Oklahoma. They became what is known today as the Fort Sill Apache Tribe. Lieutenant Hugh L. Scott commanded Troop L of the 7th Cavalry, a unit consisting entirely of Indians and considered one of the best in the West. Indian Scout ICO and other members of the troop are credited with helping tribes on the South Plains avert the bloody Ghost Dance uprising of the 1890s, in which many Indians were brutally murdered by the U.S. Army on the North Plains. The frontier disappears. The last Indian lands in Oklahoma opened for settlement in 1901. 29,000 homesteaders registered at Fort Sill during July for the land lottery. On August 6 the town of Lawton sprang up and quickly grew to become the third largest city in Oklahoma. With the disappearance of the frontier, the mission of Fort Sill gradually changed from cavalry to field artillery. During the 1890s, the post declined in importance, and was considered for closure, with the land being given to the Chiricahua Apaches. The 1st Artillery Battery arrived at Fort Sill in 1902 and the last Cavalry Regiment departed in May 1907. The artillery units required more facilities, so plans were made to replace the original structures with more modern buildings. However, William H. Taft, then Secretary of War, intervened to save the original buildings. He ordered the fort to expand to the south and west. The School of Fire for the Field Artillery was founded at Fort Sill in 1911 and continues to operate today as the world-renowned U.S. Army Field Artillery School. At various times Fort Sill has also served as home to the Infantry School of Musketry, the School for Aerial Observers, the Artillery Officers Candidate School, the Air Service Flying School and the Army Aviation School. In 1917, the Henry Post Army Airfield was constructed for artillery observation and spotting. During World War I, Montgomery M. Macomb, a brigadier general and career artillery officer who had retired in 1916, was recalled to active duty to command Fort Sill and oversee the schools and training programs that prepared soldiers for combat in France. Fort Sill was once the site of a large Boot Hill cemetery. Many soldiers who were killed during the Indian Wars were buried there, as were multiple outlaws or their victims. Early aviation at Fort Sill. Fort Sill also contains the birthplace of military combat aviation, located at the parade field at the Old Post Quadrangle at Fort Sill. Here, the 1st Aero Squadron, under Captain Benjamin D. Fowlois, uncrated their new, unassembled airplanes and put them together in 1915. They then pushed their Curtiss JN-2 planes downhill to the polo field. On August 10, they made their first flights. Unfortunately, the first airplane accident came just 2 days later, on August 12, 1915. Lieutenant Rondondo B. Sutton, the pilot, was hospitalized, but his passenger, Captain George H. Knox, the paymaster of Fort Sill, was killed. According to the Lawton Constitution newspaper article, there was a large crowd of civilians at the field to see the aircraft in flight and were, consequently, there to see the results of the accident. The large crowd of men, women and children were horrified, according to the paper. Soon after, on September 5, another plane was lost in a second crash, after which Fowlois grounded the remaining planes out of concern for safety. Undaunted, the squadron began trials with the field artillery to see if they could perform reconnaissance of field positions, but the results were disappointing, mostly due to inadequate equipment. New equipment was ordered and by October 14, operations with the field artillery were resumed. On October 22, Lieutenant T.D. Milling made the first 2 flights to test aerial photography using a Brock camera. On November 6, the squadron successfully made a photo mosaic of 42 plates. The squadron left Fort Sill on November 19 on a cross-country trip from which they would not return. They flew 6 planes to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, a total of 439 miles and a historic cross-country distance flight. The aviators were supported by a trail of supply-laden heavy trucks and their mechanics on motorcycles. The flight arrived on November 26, without any major incidents delaying them. The squadron was kept in Texas because of tension along the U.S.-Mexico border. Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa felt betrayed that the U.S. government recognized Venustiano Carranza's Mexican government. Villa began to attack Americans in northern Mexico. On March 9, 1916, Villa's troops attacked Columbus, New Mexico and a detachment of the 13th Cavalry. The town was burned and the Americans suffered 18 soldiers and civilians killed and 8 wounded. President Woodrow Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing to lead 4,800 men into Mexico to capture Villa. Villa was never killed but did receive a wound from being shot by one of his own men while being chased by troops under General Pershing. The 1st Aero Squadron was part of that army. They transferred to Texas Grounds in Mexico and began duties flying reconnaissance, delivering mail and dispatches and transporting senior officers. These simple tasks were more than their airplanes could handle. They didn't have enough power to fly over the mountains of northern Mexico. One rainstorm dumped nearly a foot of water into the cockpit of Fowlois' craft and flooded out his engine. He successfully managed to land his plane without power. Additionally, every landing in Mexico was carried out in hostile territory. Many pilots found themselves cut off from friendly lines with little more than their wits to rescue them from hostile Mexicans and Mexican officials. The squadron flew 540 missions in Mexico, averaging 36 miles per mission. After 6 weeks, they were done. Their airplanes were worn out, and 2 had crashed. 4 others needed parts and were grounded. For weeks afterward, crew members and pilots had blisters from carving new propellers out of logs. On April 20, 1916, the Army ordered the squadron back to Columbus, NM. Their only real military success was finding a lost and thirsty cavalry column. The 1st Aero Squadron received new airplanes, but these were hurriedly packed by the factory, were all missing parts and required significant modifications. The squadron did not again take to the field until they deployed to France as part of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. Today, the 3rd Reconnaissance Squadron of the U.S. Air Forces traces their unit heritage to the 1st Aero Squadron. Henry Post Army Airfield. In August 1917, Captain H. R. Ehrich surveyed a new airfield location at Fort Sill and established Henry Post Army Airfield. The field occupies a small plateau about a mile south of the main post cantonment area. Construction immediately began on wooden hangars, offices and officer housing. As the U.S. entered World War I, the airfield was used to train aerial observers for the field artillery. On August 29, 1917, the 3rd Aero Squadron left Fort Sam Houston for Fort Sill with 12 Curtiss IV airplanes under the command of Captain Weir. It was redesignated as Squadron A, Post Field, Oakland. On July 22, 1918, it was demobilized, due to the end of World War I, on January 2, 1919. Today, the 3rd Flying Training Squadron, which traces its lineage to the 3rd Aero Squadron, trains pilots at Vance Air Force Base, Enid, Oakland. The 4th Aero Squadron was also sent to Post Airfield that summer. The 4th operated as an observation school for the field artillery until it was demobilized on January 2, 1919. Today, the 394th Combat Training Squadron at Whiteman AFB, MO, traces its lineage to the 4th Aero Squadron. A variety of units were created, inactivated, assigned and reassigned as the Army's aviation assets grew. In 1922, Fort Sill was considered the busiest airport in the U.S. Aviation at Fort Sill added lighter-than-air ships to its inventory when Company A, 1st Balloon Squadron, arrived on September 5, 1917 from the Balloon School in Omaha, Nebraska. The company split to form the 25th and 26th Balloon Companies on February 16 and April 2, 1918. In order to meet the demand for trained aerial observers for field artillery, a Balloon Corps training school was set up at Post Field in 1918. During World War I, the school trained 751 officers and created 89 companies, of which 33 were deployed to Europe. The school used balloons and fixed-wing aircraft for aerial observation. Both sausage-shaped captured balloons and spherical-shaped free balloons were used in the 1920s and 30s. The balloonists were trained on free flight on the free balloons, but they had to stay within 50 miles of post and 8,000 feet. The tethered or captured balloons were for observation only. Connected to winch trucks on the ground by cable and transported at speeds as high as 60 miles an hour. They were inflated with hydrogen and operated at a maximum height of 4,300 feet. They observed and relayed fire corrective information to special operation trucks. At this time, balloon companies were a corps-level asset. The Army of World War I included an aero squadron in every corps. Other auxiliary units for a corps were an anti-aircraft machine gun and anti-aircraft artillery battalion, a remount depot bakery company, a troop transport train, a telegraph battalion, a field signal battalion, a photo section and a sales commissary unit. Self-propelled balloons were developed at Post Field in 1937. These balloons were designed to be powered to an observation point, their motors removed and observation baskets were attached. The famous balloon hangar, moved from Moorfight Field to Fort Sill in 1934, was intended to house dirigibles. The unique cross on the side of the building has no religious significance. It is part of an air circulation system designed to dry balloon fabric and parachutes. Balloons were assigned to the field until 1941. The most famous balloon pilot trained at Fort Sill was General Barksdale Hamlet, Jr. This four-star general was the commandant of the American sector of Berlin during the 1958 Berlin crisis, became the vice chief of staff of the Army, played a key role in the Cuban Missile Crisis and in the escalation of the Vietnam War. one of the U.S. Air Force's most advanced technical units, the 1st Airborne Command and Control Squadron at Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, traces its lineage through the 1st Balloon Company. An enduring legacy Fort Sill Aviation, the 44th Aero Squadron was assigned to support the Field Artillery School at Post Field in August 1922. It was reassigned on July 31, 1927 to the Air Corps Training Center. The unit today is not active. It was replaced by the 88th Observation Squadron, which moved from Brooks Field, Texas, to Fort Sill in September 1928. The 88th left Post Field in 1931 and today is known as the 436th Training Squadron out of DSAFB, Texas. In the 1930s the WPA and Army built several new permanent structures to replace the World War I-era tar paper buildings. Building 4908, the aircraft maintenance hangar built in 1932, is the oldest building at the airfield. Field Artillery Officers and the Olympics, Fort Sill, Oklahoma and the Field Artillery Branch saw their only Olympic medals awarded in the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics. Lieutenant Richard Mayo. The first medal came from a totally unexpected source, a wiry field artillery lieutenant who took part in the pentathlon. In those years for the pentathlon, the competitors completed 5 different events on consecutive days. In the pentathlon, competitors are ranked in the order they finish in each event and all their rankings are added to determine the gold medalist. The lower your points, the better. Mayo started well, finishing second in the horse riding phase behind Bo Lindman of Sweden. Lindman was a favorite, as he previously won gold in the 1924 Summer Olympics in Paris. The next day, Mayo finished well in fencing as he tied with Elie Masomfi of Hungary at 4:1/2. Lindman was ranked 2:1/2 in fencing, so he held on to the lead with just 3:1/2 points. At the end of Phase 2, the unheralded Mayo was second with 6:1/2 points. The shooting results put Mayo in the lead. He finished first and had a total of 7:1/2 points. Lindman finished 19th, so the Swede now had 21:1/2 points. Carlo Simonetti of Italy came out of the first 3 rounds with 17 points. Another Swede, Johan Gabriel Oxenstierna, who finished 14th in fencing, brought himself back into competition by finishing second in the shooting phase. Oxenstierna had 20 points. With just 2 events left, the standings were Mayo 7-12, Simonetti 17, Oxenstierna 20, Lindman 21:1/2. Mayo and Simonetti both finished in the pack in the swimming phase. Mayo finished 14 and Simonetti was 15. Meanwhile, the Swedes finished 5 and 9 in the swim and were in striking distance of Mayo unregistered trademark S lead. Mayo was 3:1/2 points ahead of Oxenstierna and 4 points ahead of Thofelt with just the final run. Charles Percy Digby Liggard and Geoffrey McDougall of Great Britain finished 1-2 in the run, but Lindman finished 4th for a total of 35:1/2 points. Oxenstierna unregistered trademark S 7th place finish brought his total points to 32. Meanwhile, Mayo finished 17th and with 38:1/2 points took the bronze medal. Richard Mayo remained in the Army and made it his career. During World War II, he commanded the 15th Army in combat in France and Germany. Mayo retired in 1956 as a brigadier general, Lieutenant Edwin Argo Los Angeles, August 11, 1932. 3 members of the U.S. Army equestrian team Major Harry Chamberlain, Captain Edwin Y. Argo and Lieutenant L.T. Thompson started the 3-day event at the 1932 Olympics. The 3 faced the best military riders of Holland, Sweden, Japan and Mexico. On the first day of the event, all riders faced a training test. The second day was an endurance ride of 22.5 miles over 5 different courses and the last day was stadium jumping where they rode a course of 12 jumps at a 14-mile-per-hour gait. Argo, the only field artillery officer in this part of the competition, rode Honolulu Tomboy in a remarkable performance without a fault at a jump during the stadium jumping. The only rider without a fault that day. The U.S. team led from the start and was described by the 1932 Field Artillery Journal as a glorious achievement for our riders and horses, as they took the gold medal in the team competition. In the individual standings, Thompson took the silver for the U.S., Chamberlain finished fourth and Argo eighth. Note, at that time, Argo was assigned to 1st Field Artillery at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. World War II to present. By 1940, the Field Artillery School had permission to train its own fixed-wing pilots as field artillery spotters. The Army Air Corps turned post-field over to the FA school and the facility began to swarm with grasshoppers and bird dogs. Part of the Department of Air Training. What was originally a 5-week course was expanded, and special primary flight schools for prospective field artillery pilots were set up at Pittsburgh, Kansas, and Denton, Texas. After attending one of these primary schools, pilots went to post-field for their advanced training, which included short field procedures and observer training. By the end of the war, 262 pilots and 2,262 mechanics were trained at post-field. In 1942, Fort Sill held approximately 700 Japanese Americans interned by the Department of Justice, mostly non-citizen who had been arrested as spies and fifth columnists, despite a lack of evidence supporting the charges against them. 350 of these internees were transfers from Fort Missoula, Montana. One of them, Kanesaburo Oshima, was killed by a guard when he suffered a mental break and attempted to escape on May 12. In addition to the Japanese American inmates, Fort Sill held German prisoners of war. Advancements in air defense artillery and radar systems during the Cold War made the slow-moving grasshoppers and bird dogs easy targets, especially in forward areas. Because of this vulnerability, they were phased out during the Vietnam War. During that conflict, 469 bird dogs were lost to all causes. 284 of these were lost by the Army. The Army Ground Forces Air Training School was established at Post Field on December 7, 1945. In October 1948, pilot training for helicopters H-25 and H-13 began. The first warrant officer class began in 1951. The school was transferred to Fort Rucker in 1954, but Post Field still had an assortment of helicopter units that called it home. In 1963, the 1st Aerial Artillery Group was organized to test equipping CH-34 helicopters with rocket pods attached to each side. The rockets converted a transport aircraft, an easy target in most combat situations, into a sophisticated flying weapon capable of direct or indirect fires. It was the ancestor to the Cheyenne and Longbow attack helicopters of today. The 295th Aviation Company was established at Fort Sill in the 60s. The unit was assigned 10 Skycran CH-54A helicopters. The unit also had a UH-1 administrative aircraft, and later an OH-58 joined the unit. It was the mother company to the 355th Aviation Company and the 273rd Aviation Company. In December 1969, the unit was deployed to Finthon Army Airfield near Mainz, Germany. Today, the company is designated F Company, 159th Aviation Regiment, and is equipped with CH-47 Chinooks. Post Field is the oldest continually operating airfield in the U.S. Army. Historic recognition: Fort Sill was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1960. Cemeteries. There are various cemeteries on Fort Sill, with their own histories and significance. The most famous is the Post Cemetery, at the intersection of Macomb and Geronimo Roads. Many Indian chiefs who signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty came to rest at Fort Sill Post Cemetery. Unlike most cemeteries of its day, it was never segregated. Troopers of the 10th Cavalry Regiment, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, who died at Fort Sill lie next to these chiefs. Officers, soldiers, spouses and children lie side by side regardless of their race or social status. The most famous person buried at Fort Sill is the Apache warrior known as Geronimo. Geronimo is buried in the Apache Cemetery on East Range. Because his grave is off the beaten path, the route is marked with signs. Others buried at Fort Sill include Kiowa Chief Satanta, and Comanche Chief Quinnipiac. The most controversial cemetery on Post lies under Henry Post Army Airfield. The old Indian Agency Cemetery, which includes both Comanche and white remains, is located just south of the last hangar at the airfield. In the 1950s, in order to reduce the hazard of airplanes or helicopters landing or parking in the area, Army engineers took down all the gravestones and covered the entire area with a 4-inch cover of earth. The earliest known still existing listing of those buried at this cemetery is known as the 1917 Harper's List. For many years, the cemetery sat forgotten by history. In 1984, Thomas Spivey, an archaeologist and curator of the Fort Sill National Landmark and Museum, completed a scientific investigation of records in the site. He identified 64 persons buried in that cemetery by name, but another 50 graves were listed as unknown. Out of respect, none of the remains have ever been dug up or disturbed. Activities today: a detachment of the United States Marine Corps, consisting of a firing battery and commanded by a colonel, is stationed at Fort Sill. Referred to as the MARDIT, the detachment works with the Field Artillery School to train Marine artillerymen. Marines also serve as gunnery and fire support instructors at the Field Artillery Officer Basic Course, and as small group leaders at the Field Artillery Captain's Career Course. All Marine artillery officers attend the Field Artillery School and are trained alongside their Army counterparts. The 77th Army Band is part of the Fire Center of Excellence. It was originally organized on March 1, 1907 at Fort DuPont, Delaware as the 13th Band, Coast Artillery. Another special detachment is the Field Artillery Half Section, an 8-man group representative of the Flying Artillery, which was drawn by a team of horses around the turn of the 20th century. The half section was established in 1969 to celebrate Fort Sill's centennial. The soldiers are volunteers for the show group, while the horses, their equipment and transportation are provided through charitable donations. The popular half section has appeared in regional parades, local festivities, change of command ceremonies and a presidential inauguration parade. Tenant units: 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, 4th Battalion, 3rd Air Defense Artillery Regiment. 75th Fires Brigade, 3rd Battalion, 13th Field Artillery Regiment, 2nd Battalion, 18th Field Artillery Regiment, 1st Battalion, 17th Field Artillery Regiment, 100th Brigade Support Battalion. 214th Fires Brigade, 2nd Battalion, 4th Field Artillery Regiment, 2nd Battalion, 5th Field Artillery Regiment, 1st Battalion, 14th Field Artillery Regiment, 168th Brigade Support Battalion, Hotel Battery, 26th Field Artillery Regiment, Target Acquisition, 529th Signal Company. United States Army Field Artillery School, 428th Field Artillery Brigade, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Field Artillery, 1st Battalion, 30th Field Artillery, 1st Battalion, 78th Field Artillery. United States Army Air Defense Artillery School, Geography, Climate. Climate is characterized by relatively high temperatures and evenly distributed precipitation throughout the year. The CAR paragraph PPEN climate classification subtype for this climate is CFA. See also. References. Further reading: Nye, Wilbur S. Carbine and Lance, The Story of Old Fort Sill. University of Oklahoma Press. ISBN A9780806118567. External links: official website, Field Artillery Museum, Global Securities Fort Sill page, Fort Sill relocation information and Fort Sill Q&A, Encyclopedia of Oklahoma History and Culture Euro Fort Sill, Historic American Buildings Survey No OK 43, Fort Sill, Comanche County, OK, HABS No OK 35, Fort Sill, Old Post Headquarters, Quina Road, Fort Sill, Comanche County, OK, HABS No OK 36, Fort Sill, Sherman House, Fort Sill, Comanche County. OK, Oklahoma Digital Maps, Digital collections of Oklahoma and Indian Territory.